Greetings, everybody. This is for U.S. History 2 students, dealing with progressivism, part 3, right? So today we're looking at muckrakers. We want to define and discuss muckraking and show how it was an effective tool used by progressives to solve society's problems. The term muckraker was reserved for the journalists and novelists of the progressive era. But the literature of protest began some 2 decades earlier and was the work of philosophers and social scientists like Lester Ward and Henry George. However, historians date the start of muckraking with Lincoln Steffens with his article Tweed Days in St. Louis in October of 1902 in an issue published by McClure. For it was not until then that such writings captivated the nation. Muckraking rises not because Americans fall in love with honesty all of a sudden, but because of radical changes which society had just undergone. So muckraking flared up at a time when land was no longer freely available, and large-scale industry had begun to make clear that success was no longer easily possible for most folks. So this is, as industrialization has entrenched in the beginning of the 1900s, and it's quite clear that people are on their own and they're vulnerable in this highly industrialized, complex society. Muckrakers did the work that no one else wanted to do when it came to journalism. They exposed the particular inequities that afflicted American life, stirred public opinion to the point where it was willing to support men like Roosevelt and Wilson in their reform programs, and planted the seeds of progressivism which the politicians were able to harvest and enact policy that could express change in society. Muckraking was primarily a magazine phenomena, but made possible by the development of inexpensive periodicals like McClure's, Everybody's, Cosmopolitan, and Collier's, with mass circulation dealing with controversial questions. Examples of muckraking: one, in January of 1903 in McClure's magazine. It was sold out, and the people clamored for more when it published Ida Tarbell's series on Standard Oil and by the methods by which that company was built. Tarbell published a wealth of statistical data showing how Rockefeller had crushed his competitors, seized control of natural resources, and purchased legislative favors. Tarbell was paid $4,000 an article, big money back then. And Lincoln Stevens' essay on corruption in American society brought in $2,000 an article. So with big money like this, with backing like this, journalists were able to search court records, locate witnesses, dig up mountains of facts. So earlier social critics like Lester Ward or Henry George relied partly on public records and partly on guesswork. But the new muckrakers named names and recounted misdeeds in sensational detail. Perhaps the most famous accomplishment of the muckrakers was a series by Lincoln Steffens, who investigated Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, St. Louis, and a host of other American cities, and found them all suffering from the same ills: political corruption. Right. So in Minneapolis, Stevens achieved one of the great coups in the history of reporting. Steffens obtained the ledger in which graft collectors had entered their accounts and the names of the persons to whom money was paid, and photographed its pages. Stevens published the names of public officials on the take and told how, under the mayor, Dr. Ames, who had been elected twice by Republicans and then twice by Democrats, the chief of detectives, had invited criminals to Minneapolis, fired 107 honest policemen, and freed prisoners to collect revenues for the gang. Stevens received many letters from other cities after his articles to come to their cities to expose corruption and whatnot. It is said that this phase of the progressive movement must be understood as a version of the old Protestant revivals. It was a revival for the sins of society, the seeking of salvation for society, expressed through journalism this time, not through ministers. Upton Sinclair wrote a novel, The Jungle, a very famous book that had far-reaching effects. It revealed filthy conditions in Chicago meat packing industry. Sinclair wrote, quote, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race upon it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were a nuisance, and the packers would put poison bread on them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers all together. This is no fairy story, and it's no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the men who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even if they saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit," unquote. So Roosevelt read Sinclair's account of these conditions and dispatched 2 agents to confirm all he wrote. The agents' report read in part as follows, quote, "We saw meat shoveled from filthy wooden floors, piled on tables rarely washed, pushed from room to room into rotten box carts, and all of which processes it was in the way of gathering dirt, splinters, floor filth, and the exportation of tuberculosis of other diseased workers," unquote, from the government agents that were confirming Sinclair's work within the jungle. As a result of Sinclair's muckraking, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed, and it required federal inspection of meats destined for interstate commerce, and empowered officials in the agricultural department to impose standards of sanitation. Also enacted on that day was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which placed restrictions on muckrakers and prepared foods and patent medicines, and forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated, misbranded, or harmful foods, drugs, and liquors. But despite federal inspections for meat that was destined for interstate transportation crossing state borders, there was no such legislation for meat that was transported within the origin state, right? Federal government didn't have jurisdiction within state borders if it wasn't leaving the state. So as recently as 1967, 22 states did not require mandatory inspection of livestock before and after slaughter, and 8 states had no meat inspection at all. So this is an ancient history. These state plants were often peddling what was known in the industry as 4D meat. This stood for dead, dying, diseased, and disabled. And this meat obviously could not pass federal inspections. Large meat packers such as Armour, Swift, and Wilson and Company claimed that they were forced into operating these non-federally inspected interstate plants by competition from unregulated establishments. So, a great many important and valuable reforms were in part adopted as a result of muckraking. So, example of the Food and Drug Administration Act. What the muckrakers tried to do was necessary. The evils were there, and there was no hope of removing them until the public was aroused to a recognition of their existence. Right. Muckraking began to decline by 1917 for a variety of reasons. Some of it had to do with supply and demand. People weren't buying these magazines as much. Others had to do with big business being shrewd and cynical and suppressing circulation. And others had to do with civil liberties being suppressed during World War I. That we'll take a look at later in another lecture. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll talk to you guys later. And stay tuned for part 4.